Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good morrow, good friends. It is, full disclosure, the day after Easter. I'm a worship leader. I'm exhausted. So this is going to be fun. We are here together with Mandy and myself, and our guest is a conversation about boundaries. So
Woo! We love boundaries here.
we're learning about them. It's always a constant flux in learning about them, and I think that's okay because they change. You know, the boundaries you set for yourself when you're 16 are not going to be the same as when you're 30.
And if they are, that's a problem. So
Also,
boundaries change with us.
super proud if there's any 16-year-olds out there setting good emotional boundaries. I'm so proud of you. Please.
Also super proud if there's any 16-year-olds out there listening to us.
True. We talk about some heavy stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
If you're 16, let us know. We want to hear what you think.
Yeah.
Okay. So, today we're looking at topics, and boundaries keeps coming up with specifically emotional boundaries. And we think that we have both had a kind of a rocky road figuring out what our boundaries should be for ourselves and for other people. And we know that there's a lot of people out there who are learning about boundaries at the same time. And so we have some books, we have some resources, we have some personal kind of anecdotal stuff about what helped us to start figuring it out. I'm not perfect. I'm still setting them, and they change all the time. Not erratically so, but just as relationships kind of meld and grow. And we're just going to talk a little bit about all that stuff. Anything to add before we dive in?
Let's be honest, we're still working on boundaries right now, and we still talk about them frequently and regularly. And we also suggest them to each other sometimes, which is another level of a relationship that you would have to be in order to suggest a boundary to somebody else. So let's see what you got, Kristin. You start.
Well, I want to identify what a couple of different types of boundaries are, and they don't necessarily all have to do with your emotions and your mental boundaries, but they all affect your mental well-being. So, for example, a time or an environmental boundary. If you are like me and you want to know what's happening with everyone all the time, and you're worried about work emails, and you're worried about what's going to happen when you go in the next day at work and things like that, and you find yourself overly stressing about that stuff, it's time to set a time or environmental boundary. Environmental boundary. There it is. One of the more important ones that I've set is I do not check work email when I am out of the building. And that can get tricky because I'm a contract music therapist. And so you're technically supposed to be like on call all the time. You like quote unquote set your own hours. But for example, my boss has an expectation where if she sends a client info sheet for a new client, we get a hold of that client within 24 hours. If I get sent something Saturday night after I've already left for the day, I will not address it on Tuesday morning. And she and I have worked on that where she knows she's going to send it to me on Monday, and the client can be told she is in the building from Tuesdays through Saturdays with some exceptions, and this is when you can expect to hear from her, which I appreciate because we communicated that that was my environmental and my time boundary. And that's been really great because I'm not panicking and worrying about who's going to call me off hours or who's going to try to get a hold of me. If a client, for example, I had a client, she's very sweet. She's new. She's in her 20s. Text me very late on Saturday night, and I did not answer because I don't. First of all, it's a cell phone. Yes, it's a personal number, but the more you answer and the more you respond to things outside of those certain times that you have agreed to, the more people will push that boundary. She didn't mean anything by it. She just had something on her mind and she wanted to send it to me. And when it's my business hours, I'll respond to her in an appropriate way and remind her that she might not hear back from me right away. And that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, if she sent you a message on Saturday night and you responded right away, then you're just giving her permission to text you at any point, and then she'll answer her at any time.
Yeah, and that's like the whole non-urgent term, I think, is one that I'm also really embracing, is if there's a communication that's not urgent. For example, do not disturb. Cody just discovered do not disturb like last week, and he loves it because he hates being on the phone. He hates He's awful at texting people back. He'll scroll through YouTube like for a brain break once in a while. But he just he hates notifications. He hates when people call him when he doesn't feel like talking to people. So if he can see and say, oh, this person called me, I'm going to call them back when I have time to. It's not emergent. And if it is, if someone calls you 14 times and sends you 6 messages and says SOS hospital, okay, then that's emergent.
Yeah.
Right? But
Right.
not all messages and not all phone calls are emergent. And that's a huge thing for, I think, people our age
Mm-hmm.
to get to know with each other. I'm not on
Mm-hmm.
my phone all the time. Other people are on their phones all the time, but just because someone's on their phone all the time doesn't mean that you are able to expect them to treat
Right.
everything like an emergent issue.
And that's something that I'm working on because if you're like me and you don't like having your little red butt push notifications on your phone that says the number of text messages you have, or even when you go into the messages and the little number at the top and you don't want there to be a number there, then you feel like you have to respond to people just to clear out your quote to-do list in a way. But then it just takes up so much of your time and so much of your brain power. And so there's definitely points in my day where I will maybe be on my phone or looking at my phone, but I'm not answering messages. I also love do not disturb. You'll in the iPhones, you also have personal and work mode too, and sleep mode. So those are all fun to put together and try to figure them out. And I have those. And then I only get the notifications for the people or the times, get a phone call can come through when I feel like I'm prepared to take a phone call.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this is a big thing for honestly everybody because, especially our age and younger, I would say, are the ones that just want to answer so rapidly. But then what I also love that iPhone just did was put on the unread message so you can read it and mark it unread and get back to it later now, which is
I
amazing.
didn't know that. I need
It's,
that because I answer,
yes.
I open text messages and forget about them.
Yep.
Oh,
And that's why I would always respond right away because if I didn't respond right away, I would forget and I would never get back to the person. So I put the unread notification up. You just swipe right on the message and then you can unread the message and then it stays there. And that helps me not have things on do not disturb as much, but also just mark it so I know I need to get back to it. And then I think just getting used to being okay with having 5, 8, 10, 12 messages that I need to answer at one point when I can sit down and just answer all my messages at one time. And it's a good boundary to have. I also have like my do not disturb set where I can get phone calls about my daughter at any point in time, but I don't get random phone calls for work or something like that too. This was easier for me to set as a work boundary, like you were talking about with work hours, when I had a work phone, because I would just
mhm.
leave and turn my phone off. And I would not turn my phone back on until I went back to work the next day. That was also a hard boundary for me at the time because I didn't, I was working in hospice. And so you don't want to be doing that work outside. You have to take care of yourself. And that was really important. When I moved to my next job past that and I no longer had a work phone, relationships got really blended with friendships and work things as well. So then I was getting text messages for hanging out or doing something fun and also text messages from the same people for work related things. And those lines got very blurred. And over time, it burns you out because you just don't even want to see a message from them because you had work, and then you were texting during the night or during the weekend or wherever because other people may not have those same boundaries. And so it caused a little bit of conflict sometimes, like you never got back to me or I need this by tomorrow and it was on a Friday or something. And it's like, I'm sorry, I don't work on the weekends and I'm not going to answer you. But in the same text message, it would be, hey, you want to hang out tonight?
Mhm.
Also, I need this by tomorrow, and that's happened to me over multiple jobs. So
That's
it is a
confusing.
lot harder to hold that boundary when you have those blended friendships and work relationships together.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Because I wish that there was I don't think there's one hard line boundary that I hold in my
Mhm.
life, but that's interesting that there's always some gray areas. Like the time one, it is a pretty hard one, but if there is an emergency or if my boss has a question about my invoice, like, yes, I want to get paid. And she's like, hey, I'm
Mhm.
working on this on a Sunday afternoon. So sorry to bother you. Can I ask you this question? Totally. Because then my paycheck isn't delayed. Right. And
Right.
so just being able to say, with some exceptions, but you're right. When relationships kind of blend together like that would be really confusing.
Mhm.
Completely.
And I think one boundary that I have also learned, and this just comes from having like a pure, I guess, innocent type heart at times too, is late night text messages.
Mhm.
just anything really past 9 or 9:30 isn't always the most appropriate, depending if, if it is a coworker, if it's a male or female, text messaging, even texting. I kind of like, somebody had said something to me the one day about, I had texted Reagan's dad about something for her, but it was like way past 10:30. I was like, why would you text your ex-husband that late? And so I think it's like boundaries that I'm also still learning right now of, there could be some form of a hard line, pretty much of a hard line at the end of the day of like, we're not going to send text messages past 9:30 to somebody else that may get confusing, and even with, I would say I don't do that as much, like with girlfriends, I'll text later at night and stuff, and it's fine. But work things too, like sending a work email or sending a work text message at 10:15 at night is really just not appropriate for people, really on any level. Just because, again, it's like opening that door of, oh, hey, she's awake at 10 at night. She's working at 10 o'clock at night, which I understand you can have that. Again, it's like a personal boundary that it fits, it's what fits people the best. But just being mindful of time of day, sending a text message at 5:30 in the morning saying, hey, can you do this for me today, is like not the most enjoyable thing to wake up to. So it's like, I think our society has become so blurred with working at home jobs, with people not working 9 to 5s as much anymore, having just more flexibility, people working into evenings, people working early mornings. So just being mindful of when you're sending emails, when you're sending text messages. I've learned that a lot over the last few years too.
Well, if you send something at 10:30 at night, that's automatically inviting someone else to initiate something at 10:30 at night. If you send something to me after 10, I'm not going to be awake.
Mm-hmm.
I might send something. I've done this multiple times. I get up early sometimes, and I'll shoot a text message out and be like, oh no, like it's really for anybody to be hearing from me. And so I love the Hey Siri function on my phone. And I will, in the middle of a session with a client, right? If they say, hey, will you remember to bring the guitar on Friday? I said, hold on, do you want to tell Siri to do it? And they say, hey Siri, remind Kristin to bring the guitar on Friday at 2.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just great because then they get to be a part of that. I'm confirming that I'm not going to forget because it's in my phone. And that is a notification that's really important for me to get, is my reminders. So anyway, we're on phone chat a lot, but I think that's, technology really allows us to be super connected to everybody at all times,
Yeah.
which is really hard. And so another type of boundary that is, I think, is all tied into, it can be tied into time, it can be tied into space, it can be tied into social media, it can be tied into comparison, those emotional boundaries. And so I have a couple of different things. I have a couple of different resources that I'm reading from and that I'm going to look at while we're chatting here. So first of all, we kind of want to define an emotional boundary. And I found one that I really liked. There's all sorts of different blurbs on what it is. But the one that I found recently that I like, because it's very straightforward, it's from a website called Road to Growth Counseling, and I'll link it in the notes, but it says emotional boundaries involve separating your own feelings from another's feelings. I'm going to say that again so I don't stutter, but emotional boundaries involve separating your feelings from another's feelings. Violations include taking responsibility for another's feelings, letting another's feelings dictate your own, sacrificing your own needs to please another, blaming others for your problems, and accepting responsibility for theirs. So the most important part, I think, about that definition is, if you pay close attention, it says violations include, and those are all of the things that you, as the boundary setter, do. Other people do not violate your boundaries. You allow other people to violate your boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
That is huge mindset change, because it takes the victim mindset off of our shoulders and it gives us the responsibility to care for ourselves in that way. When I was thinking about that, that's completely true. And so I'm going to tangent just a little bit here. But when I'm reading, it's taken me forever because I keep doing chapter by chapter, but I'm reading this book right now. It's called Good Boundaries and Goodbyes by Lysa TerKeurst. We obviously love TerKeurst. We've recommended several of her books. But I put a big orange circle around this little paragraph that says, setting a boundary is being responsible enough to reduce the access we grant to others based on their ability to be responsible with that access, right? So, to put it in a very specific term, you are not going to give your 6-year-old access to your entire bank account because your home would then be a carnival with a skee ball machine and one of those little horses that goes up and down. That would be a lot of fun, but that's not a good boundary. She should not have access to your entire bank account and what she would like to buy. We should ask her that one day, by the way. If you were given all of the money in the world, what would you do with it? That'd be a fascinating question.
Should probably go to one of those crane machines at like the diner or something.
And lose all of it.
One of those things where I cannot say no enough and she still asks every time.
So this next sentence I circled and underlined because I think this one spoke to me really, really heavily. It says people who are irresponsible with our hearts should not be granted great access to our hearts.
hmm
So when we put boundaries up, it's access not only to our lives but to our hearts.
hmm
And as two helping professionals, as two empaths, that can be so, so incredibly challenging because our heart is what we give to people
hmm
and our heart is what leads most decisions. And I personally feel when I draw a boundary around someone's access to my heart and my emotions and my experience in our interpersonal relationship, I feel like the bad guy. And
hmm
I feel like I am taking something from them when in reality, they just feel entitled to my
hmm
heart because I've given that to them.
hmm
The tangent continues with another quote. I know I'm a mess, but this is from another. It's an Instagram account that I like to follow. His name is Logan Cohen, and he is at Healing Humanity 777. And it's about how other people will consider you to be the problem because he
hmm
says when you start to set boundaries, be prepared that people will think you are the problem because they are so used to enabling and
hmm
codependency that healthy boundaries will seem that you lack the empathy or you just don't care.
hmm
Reality in my life, if I have drawn boundaries, it's because you've hurt me for so long and with such consistency that
hmm
I can no longer engage in that relationship in a healthy way that doesn't break me.
hmm Yeah, and no boundary is easy to set.
Mhm.
They are so hard. There's boundaries that I have set in my life that I think about every single day and wish I could change them
Mhm.
because of being the empath, because of having that mindset where I want to help people, I want to be there for people, I want to support people. I love somebody so much, but they are hurting me and they are doing something to me that is not okay. That the only way for me to move forward is to continue to love them, but to put that boundary up.
Mhm.
And it's very hard to do.
Mhm.
It's very hard for people to understand the same concept. People think that you're mean. People think that you're being rude. I also, this may not be, don't take this for like a resource, but one of the things that I always think about when I set a boundary is what would people have done 200 years ago? Because
Mhm.
I feel like technology and phones and emails and computers and access has made these boundaries so much harder to set.
Mhm.
So I think 200 years ago, let's say, okay, you lived pretty much in like towns and communities. You didn't really have family that lived across the country. You know, somebody hurt you, they either left or the community like kind of ganged up on the person or whatever. And it just seemed like you had more control of it because your boundary was literally your front door.
Mhm.
And all
Mhm.
you had to do was shut the door, and that was it. They had no way of access to you. They couldn't call you. They couldn't text you. They couldn't message you. They couldn't find you on Facebook, Instagram, email, whatever. Like, there's so many ways that people can get a hold of us now that
Mhm.
it is very kind of scary sometimes, especially when you put up like safety boundaries. If there's a
Mhm.
relationship problem or if there's, a mental health problem with somebody in your life, and those are all boundaries as well. But I just think like, when do I need to close my front door and
Mhm.
say no? And when can I open the front door and invite somebody inside? And again, kind of going off of the time boundaries, but also just going off of everything else. I'm
Mhm.
not going to let somebody in my house that continues to talk to me in an inappropriate way, that continues to hurt me,
Mhm.
either physically, emotionally, verbally, spiritually, mentally, all of the things.
Mhm.
It's who's going to be let in the front door. And if I would not open my door to you and invite you into my house, why would I engage in a relationship with you
Mhm.
that's harmful? And we know somebody that a past guest of ours, she only follows people on social media that she would say hi to in real life. And I
Mhm.
love that boundary because there's so many people on social media that I would never say hi to, but you follow me on social media. I just
Mhm.
would never talk to you. Just wouldn't.
Yeah.
So knowing when people are, when that door needs to be shut is
Mhm.
just really important. And that takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of self awareness. Um, and it may take support from other people. There are some boundaries in my life that I need somebody to validate with me. Yes, that's a good
Mhm.
boundary. Yes,
Mhm.
that's a good boundary. Keep doing it. Keep doing it.
Yeah.
Um, because they're
When
hard.
when can you identify that the door needs to be shut? What's a red flag for you?
Confusion,
Mm.
um, chaos,
Feeling like you're crazy.
feeling like I'm crazy, um, consistency. Like if somebody is texting me 25 times in an hour, that's not you, then it's like, okay, this is way too much.
Yeah.
Um, if somebody's crossing my own boundaries, if somebody sends me messages at 11 o'clock at night, I'm not okay with that.
Mhm.
Um, things, super early in the morning, messages that need to be done. And then again, this goes across all parts of life, personal, work, um, even with my child, like anything like that. Um, so those are some of mine. What are your red flags?
Mhm. Consistency, I think, is a good one. I think I I have awareness that every single person is a different human and we all have
Mhm.
different strengths and we all have different weaknesses. For example, I have a friend who I know she will not answer within like 72 hours if I text her. It's not because she doesn't love me. We love each other very much. She has a kid, she's a teacher, she's got a bunch of stuff going on at the farm they're trying to build in their house. And so we'll text each other like once every couple weeks and maybe we'll get back to each other. That doesn't mean that we're not attempting to see each other eye to eye. We're friends.
Mhm.
There's a difference between that and me understanding that and me expecting something different from her. So I'm
Yeah.
going to go into this comment saying that every single person is different. But
Yeah.
if you consistently have interactions with someone that it's similar to the holiday conversation that we had. If you consistently feel awful leaving interactions, if you're nervous to see that person or to talk to that person, if you
Mhm.
consistently think, I wonder what they're thinking, are they mad at me? And that's my typical, like,
Mhm.
Cody will have a bad day at work and he's like, I'm so mad. I'm like, at me? And he's like, no. What are you talking about? But if you have anxiety about communicating with this person
Mhm.
because you just don't know where you stand with them, that's the
Mhm.
consistency that I look for. And
Mhm.
I make a great amount of effort, and I'm the type of person who, if there is something not great, like I'll give you a really concrete example, right? My dad was PO'd at me over something this past year, and he flat out did not talk to me for several weeks. And I called him and I said, "Hi, I'm coming down on this date. I know you're home. Let's go to lunch."
Mhm.
And I just had to. And I just said, "We're going to go to lunch and we're going to talk." And we did. And since then things have gotten progressively better. But it would not have happened if I didn't quite literally force him to sit down. I didn't force him.
Mhm.
He's an adult, he can make his own decisions.
Mhm.
I said, "Mom told me you're free. Mom told me you're home. Here's the time I have. What would you like to do and where would you like to go?"
Mhm.
And if I hadn't made that first step, the whole process would have been so much longer. I have
And
someone
may
else.
never have progressed.
Exactly. And
Mhm.
like, listen, I get my stubbornness from my dad for sure. So the two of us could have feuded for a while, and that's not what I want.
Mhm.
Um, there's another person in my life who I consistently, over the course of an entire year, right? An entire year, I made consistent effort to reach out to this person to say, hey, I know things are a little weird. Let's talk about it. Or,
Mhm.
hey, I have some time. Do you want to do this? Or just reaching out and being a friend and trying to love them while they were uncomfortable loving me. There's a whole big backstory. Not going to get into it. This is not the place. But being able to say, I made such consistent effort and it always came up short. And whatever effort I made was not enough for that person.
Mhm.
I've stopped making that effort now and it feels so much
Mhm.
better. That doesn't mean I don't love them. That doesn't mean that
Mhm.
I'm not sad that we don't talk anymore, but that it's just the reality of it. And
Mhm.
it's really unfortunate that different people can sometimes be so different that we can't overcome each other's boundaries and
Mhm.
understanding each other's
Right.
needs and wants. And I just there's some friendships that the boundary is when I hear from them, I hear from them, and I will love them. But the
Yeah.
boundary for some people is I will not make the first move because every first move that I've made in the past year has been disappointing. And you
Mhm.
don't need to live your life in disappointment. That's not fair to you. Don't
Mhm.
keep being the martyr. You're not a
Yeah.
bad person if you say, my boundary is not reaching out.
Mhm.
My boundary is coming with open arms if you would like to reach out.
Sure.
But my boundary is to continue on with my life.
Mhm. Yeah,
And that
and I
like the next
think
person.
even with boundaries too, they're with every single person inside your house and outside your house. So you have
Mhm.
work boundaries, you have personal friendship boundaries, you have in your house boundaries, whether that's a spouse or a child or a parent or whoever lives in your house, boundaries. And then you have, even boundaries within yourself too that you have. So you have all these different layers of boundaries that you need to be aware of and work on. And if nobody has it perfect and they're always changing.
Mhm.
My biggest piece of advice is a boundary does not get removed unless there is actual progress being made.
Mhm.
So I have a boundary in my life with somebody that breaks my heart every single day. And it is a very, very hard boundary for me to hold. But the pain and the destruction that was caused was so terrible. And unless there's evidence of counseling, evidence of building trust,
Mhm.
evidence of being different, that boundary cannot change for my
Mhm.
own safety, for this person's safety, for the well-being just of my life.
Mhm.
And it's a hard thing, but when I hear then feedback from either other people in this person's life or whatever saying that this person is no different, this person is acting this way, or here's a story that just happened last week, and like there's no evidence of change, I can't
Mhm.
change that boundary. So
Mhm.
I can put the boundaries up, I can't change another person. So same with you, with a boundary in your life, you can put those boundaries up and then you're seen as quote bad, hurtful, harmful, not empathetic, you
Mhm.
don't care. But it's really that person's self awareness that needs to change, that we can't change for them. They have to do that, they have to accept it. And when people come to you and they ask you your boundaries, why do you do this? Why do you do this? It's like, this is for me. And this is, if you would like to know, I'd be happy to share with you. But if they're not aware to know, nothing's going to change. So
Mhm.
no evidence of change,
Mhm.
no boundary gets removed.
That's a huge, huge comment on self awareness, too. It's because some people's self awareness will never get there. And that's when, again, I'm going to go back to Lisa's book where it says sometimes we're not saying that all boundaries mean that you're putting up your brick walls and not talking to
Mhm.
anybody who's ever said anything nasty to you, because then, I wouldn't have any friends,
Right.
because we've all gotten tiffy and we've all gotten like back and forth and we've all said things that we don't necessarily mean and then we apologize for
Mhm.
them, right? If every single person put up the walls immediately, that is not an effective boundary. That's isolation.
Yeah.
But there are some boundaries that with consistent work, they still aren't healing. You're right. Just because it's better doesn't mean it's healed. Sometimes that does have to be a goodbye to that person. And
Yeah.
what really stinks is that we can love and we can wait, but some people's self awareness will never improve.
Mhm.
And one thing that I wish and hope for everybody is that we could all just turn inward a little bit. And instead of saying, what did that person do to me? Because there are things in life that are done to us for sure.
Mhm. Yeah.
If if it's someone that we love and it's a relationship that has changed, instead of what did that person do to me, it's how did our partnership change?
Mhm.
And sometimes you don't know your partnership changes. And this is a super stinky way to find out until a mutual friend tells you something that that person might have said.
Mhm. Yeah.
And instead of, that's a big indicator of a relationship changing and boundaries needed to changes. If there's
Mhm.
gossip about you happening between two people and you hear about it from someone else and say, well, wait a minute, I wasn't aware that that person felt that way, and being able
Mhm.
to say, my boundary is I'm not talking about my personal relationships with anybody other than that person.
Mhm.
And that's a respectful boundary
Yeah.
to uphold the relationship and be able to. I have this wish and a prayer for everybody just to be open with one another and say, hey, you hurt me, and this is
Mhm.
how, and this is
Yeah.
how I'm healing. And part of my healing is taking a step back from our relationship. If
Mhm.
everyone had the bravery to say that, my goodness,
Yeah.
it would be so different. We would all be a little more introspective.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a difference in putting up a boundary versus putting up a brick wall to ignore somebody.
Hmm.
They're very different. There's a difference in putting up a boundary and avoiding conflict. So I would say my guess, I don't know, don't this is no specific statistic, but in my life I would say 90% of issues or conflict are miscommunication.
Mm.
And that would be my biggest thing. Text message, emails. If you call somebody and physically hear their voice,
Mhm.
your conversation will go different. If you
Yeah.
meet somebody, like you called your dad and said, I'm talking to you in person, if you talk to a person in person, your
Mhm.
conversation will look different
Mhm.
because keyboard warriors can say whatever they want behind a screen. They can text whatever they want. They can email whatever they want. And it can be interpreted in so many different ways.
Mhm.
This just happened to me yesterday with somebody with a text message that was sent. I said, what can I do to help? And it was misinterpreted as like a rude, sarcastic, like, what do you want me to do? Not the intention at all behind it,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
misinterpreted because it was through words and the person on the other end was hearing it from a different person's voice than my own. So,
Mhm.
big difference. You can't just say, oh, I'm setting up this boundary and you're going to build a brick wall and never speak to that person again. Oh, it's a boundary. No, that's an excuse. If
Mhm.
there's a conflict or there's an issue, it needs to be dealt with. Boundaries in my life that are set up are with people that um, I have tried. Like you said, you spent a year with somebody before you had to put in a firm boundary,
Mhm.
trying to make something work. Also, there may be people that just will never understand. Like maybe somebody is hurting you and you have told them they absolutely are clueless. You put that boundary up. That's a hard boundary for people that don't understand that. I have one of those too, where the person literally does not understand why I have that boundary and they
Mhm.
never will. And it's just something that you have to be okay with because it's your own protection of your heart
Yeah.
and your mind and your home, whatever that may be.
Mhm.
So, um, yeah, it's just a big variety. And I think boundaries, they fluctuate. We are always learning them, we are always messing them up. But
Mhm.
do not use a boundary as a crutch to a conversation that needs to be had with a person.
Mhm.
Um, And conflict is another topic. Conflict avoidant, conflict, people that love conflict. I mean, like, that's a
Yep.
whole other episode that we could talk about what that means and what that's like for everybody friendships, relationships, parents, children, coworkers, everybody else, as far as like approaching conflict. Um, so, yeah, I just don't want my prayer is that people don't use boundaries as an excuse,
Mm.
but
Mhm.
that they are used properly
Yeah.
with intention and with the ability to be removed if something changes, if that person changes. I know somebody that has a boundary that they will not speak to their parent, and there is nothing that will change that boundary.
Mhm.
And I was talking to her actually, and her dad is in hospice and
Mhm.
won't be alive much longer. And she still has no communication with him because of the harm that was done over his whole life.
Mhm.
Um, and that's a hard boundary for her.
Mhm.
She has to be okay that she may never get to see or say goodbye to her dad because it's a boundary. and there was nothing, no progress was ever made on the other end of it for her to say that she felt safe enough to remove that boundary. Um, that's hard. That
Mm.
takes courage.
Hmm.
That takes a lot of courage to do that.
And of course, outside of the context of that relationship, you look at that and say, what do you mean she won't see her dad on hospice? And then again, she is seen out of context in the lens of a bad guy, but she's protecting herself, her emotion. Can't imagine what someone would have to endure
Mhm.
to not want to speak with their parents. And I know there's so many people that are in that same boat, and it's because
Mhm.
the relationship was not healthy. And I
Yeah.
respect that immensely. And
Mhm.
just because she has that boundary doesn't mean it's easy.
Yeah.
It's probably very difficult for her to go through
Mhm.
that, to think about that.
Oh, absolutely. It would be. Some of the
Mhm.
ones that I have in my life, I think about every day. And I'm like, it would take a miracle for this to need to change. But in order for me to live a stable, not chaotic, not confused, not overly communicated, you know,
Mm.
crazy life, I
Mhm.
have to keep those boundaries in place for my own mental, emotional, spiritual safety.
Yeah.
So,
So, because I like lists, I have a tiny little checklist for you. Think about relationships in your life, right? And you have to, the first way to set a boundary is to identify why the relationship may need a boundary. And there's all sorts of different reasons. They don't necessarily even have to align with what Mandy and I have said in this episode. There are countless reasons that boundaries need to be set. So identify what type of boundary. Is it a timing? Is it environmental? Is it emotional? Is it communication based? Make a list. This is what boundary is a good boundary. This is what the bad boundary is.
mhm,
So you're actually identifying, not I'm going to set a boundary with this relationship. What is that boundary? Is the boundary with the relationship that I will call this person once per week? And if they do not answer, that's my attempt. And,
mhm.
this is not one I have, it's just a very concrete example.
Sure.
Where is the boundary? I will engage only in verbal communication with this person because we miscommunicate via text and email, right?
Mhm,
Those are some really concrete boundaries. The next step would be, if necessary, communicate that boundary. A lot of times
mhm,
you don't have to communicate boundaries because people will understand that something has changed. And if they
mhm,
approach you about it, feel free to express whatever your level of comfort is with that.
mhm,
If a boundary you might need to communicate might have to do with time and communication. For example, my
mhm,
boss and I specifically talked about my boundary of when I'm home, I'm home. When I'm home, I'm not working. And
mhm.
so we talked about that, and she has worked with me on that. So that was a partnership. The last two.
Along with that too, I don't think that you owe anybody an explanation.
Mm-mm.
You can share it. I have to put a boundary in place for me. I have sent a text message, a phone call, whatever, and just been like, this is what I need to do. I'm sorry. And that's it. And then if there's 50 text messages behind it saying you shouldn't do this, da, 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 no,
Yeah.
there's no answer. No answer. It's like, this is what it is, and this is what I need to do.
Mm-hmm.
That's the end of it.
And then yes, you do not owe anybody an explanation. I absolutely agree with that. If they approach you with a question, there's again that's kind of the gray areas where you're not going to be able to get sucked
Mhm.
into a negative or harmful relationship by explaining your boundaries. And if it goes in that
Right.
direction, having the self-awareness to notice and say, I this is still my boundary. I appreciate you respecting it.
Yeah.
And then following through and checking in when things are working and or not working. If I
Mhm.
set a boundary that I'm going to stop eating sugar and then have a carrot cake cupcake for breakfast this morning, it's delicious
Mhm.
blueberry coffee, let me tell you. That's a boundary that I'm not going to uphold, right? If I let's talk about health boundaries. If I say
Yeah.
I'm going to start a diet that doesn't have cheese, I'm not going to do it. I know that. So I'm not going to set that boundary with myself.
Yeah.
So
I also
follow
love that you said that because I was going to bring that up. When people struggle, because setting emotional and mental and time boundaries can be very difficult to even just understand. Like when somebody says you need a time boundary, like some people are like, I don't even know what that is. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how it's appropriate. So I think I equate it to the same thing. If somebody was diabetic, you're not going to feed them a tub of sugar.
Mhm.
If somebody is having cancer treatment, you're not going to put them in a kindergarten classroom with sick kids.
Mhm.
It's like there are other boundaries that are just so easy to know because you just know them. That's just how they are. You're going to lock your front door at nighttime when you go to sleep because you don't want someone in your house. You don't
Mhm.
have to think about it. It just happens. So getting other types of boundaries and taking progress in other areas and other types of boundaries that may be more of those gray areas or maybe harder to define, comparing that to the same concept. Like if I had a sick child, would I send my child with 102-degree fever into her classroom? No. So if somebody is hurting me through a text message or an email or a phone call or however that may be, it's like, would you allow that to happen? Like, is that okay? No. So then you have to figure out how to do that, how to set a boundary. And that takes time, and you can mess up and you'll eventually find it. So,
Yep. And they can change over time, and it's all
Yep.
good. Just as long as we go through this process of identifying, checking in, following through, identifying, checking in, following through, then we'll be 95 years old and we'll all have super healthy relationships, right? Because it's magic and things like that.
Yeah, we'll get it perfect someday. Just kidding.
Not going to happen, but we'll always keep working on them. I'm going to share all the resources that I shared. I know Mandy has a book that she likes that we're going to link in the show notes as well. But tell us, what is a boundary that you're really proud of yourself for setting, or what's a boundary you're struggling with? Because we're all humans and we're all here to help each other. And so you can email us at therockyroadpod@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. We are on Instagram at therockyroadpod. And we hope you have a lovely, lovely day.
Bye.